Welcome to this week's edition of Meet the Media with me, Eusebius McKasier. This week, we are focusing on the ways in which rape have been reported on in the South African press. Rape happens every day in our country. It is hardly seen, however, on our front pages unless the crime is particularly brutal, shocking, or of a high-profile nature. But of course, we will look at that a little bit later. In the first instance, as we do every week in our first segment, we have a look at the main stories of the past week's news cycle. And we are joined today by Diane Hawker, the Times' news editor, who's joining us in our studios here live in Hyde Park. Diane, thank you so much for coming in.
Good morning, Eusebius.
What does a news editor do? Are you like Santa's little helper?
Well, I don't know if I'm Santa's little helper, maybe more his sort of factory manager. So I interact with the journalists, prepare the news diary. We help with the reporters brainstorming stories, basically put together the news pages of the Times on a daily basis.
Now, you shared something fascinating with me in the holding room before the show, which is that, and perhaps you didn't anticipate this when you got the job a few months earlier, is how much of the making of good news requires you to manage the personalities, the life and the reality of who the people are, the people element of your job. Just tell us a little bit more about that, because we hear titles like news editor, but we don't know what actually it means for you on a day-to-day basis.
I mean, I think probably for me it was the most difficult thing to actually deal with because, you know, on the reporting side and on the journalism side, I've done that for several years, but this was the first time that I had to actually supervise people. And, you know, journalists can be they're very intelligent, they're very difficult sometimes to deal with, sometimes people call them divas, and you're dealing with different kinds of personalities, people that are really intelligent and they know what they want to do, but at the same time there are a lot of pressures in the industry, you know, resource constraints, various issues, and you're juggling all of that to try and get a product out at the end of it.
Let's have a look at what's been in the news lately, and unsurprisingly the SARS wars are dominating the front page stories. In your own stable, in the Sunday Times, we have Pravin Gordhan and the headline here that says, "I'm prepared to die to save SA from the thieves." And there you can see a shot of it over my left shoulder. I was like, really? Madiba, is that you? Talk us through the angle in the Sunday Times.
Well, the Sunday Times really, you see, they went with a much more sort of SARS-focused piece. So they're focusing on what happened in the internal meetings within the Revenue Service this week, the behind the scenes on that aspect of it. And you get the sense that they spoke to a number of people who had attended meetings with Pravin Gordhan, staff members most likely from the National Treasury. Yeah. And I think that also speaks to, you know, things that you see in the media about where the information comes from, to a certain extent does in a way direct the way your story goes.
That's true, yeah. We can contrast that framing, Diane, with the City Press. You've got a copy in front of you. I've got one here, NPA to charge Pravin. And obviously different investigative journalists have different sources, you have different levels of access. But by contrast, whereas Pravin is centered on the front page of the Sunday Times, in the City Press, we're hearing about what the NPA might have up its sleeve.
Yes, and you can see a lot more details about what's been going on with the Hawks investigation in this piece, and what's been going on, you know, with regards to the National Prosecuting Authority, the piece saying that the file was handed over to the NPA this week, and the NPA actually confirming that. So you can actually see very different angles, and that's one of the main things that you actually end up doing in a newsroom, is really discussing what angle you're going to take, because you're collating all this information from your sources, but ultimately you have to decide what the angle is that you're going to go with.
You know, we had a fantastic discussion on the show a couple of weeks ago about photojournalism and how choices are made about which photos to include. Because when you look at the front page selection of photo there of Sean Abrahams, the National Prosecuting Authority, who now, according to the City Press, has to decide whether or not to actually potentially charge Pravin or not. You see that picture? I mean, isn't it a delicious choice? The thought bubble that can come there, Hona or whatever else.
Well, they do say that a picture tells 1,000 words, and I think even the picture of Pravin and President Jacob Zuma, you know, Jacob Zuma looks very contemplative in the Sunday Times picture, and Pravin Gordhan sort of looking upwards. If it was a different kind of picture, it would have conveyed a completely different message. And the headline and the picture really do speak to one another. Yeah. The same with the NPA.
Now, Diane, I told you that what this show tries to do is to illuminate how the media works to the public. And when I was reading City Press this morning over my first cup of coffee, I was going through it very carefully to watch out for the tone, because there's a segment of our viewers, and some of them have already tweeted us this morning, that think that we are being easy on Pravin Gordhan. So let's actually go there. Is there such a thing as a media darling? Is it harder for you as a news editor to report on some public figures than on others because they're so well loved that that you find yourself going the extra mile to make sure that the story is really ready? Whereas by contrast, let's say this involved Gwede Mantashe, for example, or Bladen Zamande, it would have been easier to report on him needing to face the music. Do media darlings exist?
I mean, I think that they do to a certain extent, because nobody is as impartial as they would like to be. We always talk about, being objective, but it's really difficult. You come from a particular perspective in your life. You've grown up in a particular area. You've interacted with particular people. But I think that's where the newsroom discussion process comes into play, because you should never have a situation where only one person is making a very important decision. There should always be a dialogue as to how we approach certain things, and people with different perspectives coming in and saying, but hang on, what about this aspect? Have we looked at this? Are we going too lightly on that person?
Okay, so the teamwork there is important. Diane, thanks. We're going to hear a bit more from you a little bit late in the show, but thanks for illuminating how these things work in the media. Coming up still in the show, we want to know what you make of the way in which rape has been covered in the South African media. And remember, of course, you can take part in our discussion right now on Twitter. You can use the hashtag #MeetTheMedia and let us know what your thoughts are in relation to the question today. How well or not do we in the South African media cover the scourge of rape? We'll be right back. Welcome back, and thank you so much for being with us this morning on Meet the Media. Today we are talking about how the media reports on rape in South Africa. And of course, remember, you can take part by using the hashtag #MeetTheMedia. Joining me is Lisa Vetten, who's Research Associate from the Wits University Institute for Social and Economic Research. And in our Cape Town studio, eNCA's own reporter, Leanne Jansen, also joins us to unpack this very difficult but very necessary conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks very much, Eusebius. And good morning to your viewers.
Leanne, I'm going to start with you. Hopefully no gremlins. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. You have had the challenge of covering some really horrific incidences of sexual violence. One thinks, for example, of the Anine Boyson story, and dare I say it, despite the nature of that story, what a fantastic piece of work you did from a journalistic point of view. Just talk us through some of your recollections in terms of the horror of rape being assigned to such a story. What is it like as a reporter? Because first and foremost, you are a human being, you are a woman, you are a black woman in this country, and being assigned to that kind of story. What is it like?
Hi, Eusebius, and thank you so much for that compliment. You're so very right. Being a woman, a black woman in this country where rape is so rife, I always feel a sense of anxiety when I get the call that another brutal rape has taken place and I'm the likely reporter on it. With Anine Boyson, it was exactly that. I got the call about a day later of the brutal rape and murder of Anine Boyson. And because I specialize in court crime and conflict, I was then the first reporter that came to mind to go to Bredasdorp. When I got there, I went to the crime scene, and there were still bloodied rocks at the scene. There were buttons that were probably ripped off somebody's jacket or shirt that night. And when you stand there, you just get the sense that that could have been me. That this 17-year-old was raped, beaten, brutally beaten, disemboweled, objects stuffed up a vagina. There are things that we cannot tell the viewers. We kind of sugarcoat the story. We tell you how gruesome the story was, but we sugarcoat it in a way that it's digestible for the viewer. But on the flip side, me as a woman, I stand there and I have to take in all these gruesome details and go home and kind of have to digest it for myself. It was really gruesome. That was probably one of the most gruesome stories I've had to cover.
So before we bring in Lisa, I've got to ask you, Leanne, I mean, how do you deal with it on an emotional level? Because when you are a reporter, you get assigned in the morning, you go on the story, you come back. We don't have social workers waiting for you. We don't have debriefs happening in the newsroom. We ourselves, because rape is so endemic, know of rape if we're not victims ourselves as reporters. So you go home at night with all of that emotional stuff from the day's work. How do you deal with that?
Well, I have to be my own psychologist and psychiatrist. And, you know, I rely very heavily on friends and my partner who I can speak with. And that is my debriefing at night. Sometimes I'll go home at night and sob because I feel just the sense of heaviness that there's really nothing I can do about it. I can report on it till I'm blue in the face, but there's not much I personally can do to help the family of Anine Boysen, or the family of Francisca Blochliger, or the family of Sinotolo in Khayelitsha. There's not much we can do other than report on it. You know, and as a woman, it's really hard. You go home and you sit and think, okay, now what next?
Absolutely.
And am I next? Is someone close to me next? What next is in store for me?
Lisa, it's interesting that Leanne is talking there about how constrained the newsroom is for anyone dealing with reports of rape that they get assigned to. And if you're a black woman in particular in the newsroom, how difficult it is. And yet, at the same time, as a researcher, you know that still we have to talk, unfortunately, about patterns of reporting that don't get it right, that doesn't help from the point of view of the media overall in aggregate. Talk to me about some of the pitfalls when it comes to sexual violence reporting in South Africa.
Yes, because I think the key question really here is we do need to talk about it, but it's the way we talk about it that's the problem, or else actually enhances our understanding. And I think just to pick up on what Leanne was saying, is because rape can be so horrifying, there is a tendency to zone in on the horror and to actually mobilize around pain and feeling. And in a sense, because it is so horrifying, that horror can become overwhelming and it actually switches people off from listening, watching and paying attention. So I think one has to strike a very fine balance between getting across the enormity and the overwhelming tragedy of what has happened versus not actually making women more frightened, because every time they switch on the TV, there's yet another horrifying, brutal, vicious story that just makes them feel more unsafe. So we've got to balance that with getting some understanding of what rape is like. And I'm just thinking of an experience I had recently we were doing domestic violence on a different television station. And they had a woman talking about her experience. But for her, it was still very raw, it was very painful, and she was stumbling over it, and she was stopping and talking about things which the presenter wasn't that interested in. He wanted her to talk about the viciousness of the beatings, of how badly it felt towards her. And that was not for her the most important aspect of her experience. So I think that again goes back to this tendency to want to focus on the horror, because that's what connects with people, rather than listening to what the woman wants to say. And also cutting her short, because she wasn't packaging and presenting her story. The
soundbite that we love so much.
And there were still all these other little segments that had to be fitted in, and she hadn't yet got to the bits that the presenter thought were important, but might not have been that important to her. So I think there's also that desire to want to package. You want to get the horror across, but you want to prettily package in a way that's easily digestible, and so that you can move on to the next segment immediately.
Which raises the question, Leanne, and I have full permission from our bosses that you can be honest about eNCA as well, which raises the question, what level of support and what level of training is there if you're going to be covering, for lack of a better phrase, which we'll talk about later some more, the beat of rape or the beat of sexual violence? Because to have the kind of empathy, the patience, as a presenter or as a reporter that Lisa is talking about, I mean, I can almost forgive someone being fresh out of journalism school for not having these kind of issues top of mind when they are looking for that soundbite. What training or not did you have that enabled you to go to the crime scene in the Anine Boysen story, or was it a case of learning on the beat?
It was exactly a case of learning on the beat. There's no training that a tertiary institution can give you. There's no training that my bosses could give me to go out and report on stories like this. I think you either have the inherent quality to report on issues like rape, or you don't. You do need a strong level of empathy. Like Lisa said, you cannot cut off a rape survivor trying to tell you their story. And I've had this many times where I'd sit in an interview for over an hour, just allowing the survivor or a victim of whichever gender-based violence we speak of to tell their story. And when I get back to the office, it's then up to me. The onus is on me then to choose whichever parts and sound bites I then want. But there is no level of training that anyone can give you to help you report on stories like this. I've been doing it for about 12 years, and I think I've had to learn the hard way over the past couple of years, over the past decade, on how to report on rape, how to report on it sensitively, how to report on it accurately, and how to get both the horror, the sensitivity, and the point across.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Lisa, you know, there's the other tendency is that we tend to be very legalistic in our reporting when it comes to sexual violence, right? But of course, the bigger issue is an issue around rape culture. But even a phrase like rape culture, for many of us men in particular, sometimes becomes a ridiculous trigger. We see it as, oh, well, you know, the media is just being liberal and inventing this kind of stuff. What would it mean practically for our media houses to have a wider lens that is not just legalistic, but that looks at some of these sort of social and psychological issues that are very hard to get your fingertips on? I mean, a phrase like rape culture, what does it mean for eNCA to really delve into rape culture?
I mean, I think the challenge here is to move beyond just focusing on someone's pain, because I think that's what we use to get people to watch the news. We need to look at rape as a multidimensional problem. And in fact, we shouldn't just be focusing on rape. We should be looking at the larger problem of sexual violence and coercion in South Africa. Sexual harassment gets very little airtime, very little at all. And yet, if you've been watching the courts, and we're talking legalistically now, there have been some very significant cases going through that have set some important precedent around amounts, but there's been no coverage in the media around that. I think one's got to look at rape as a health problem, as a legal problem, as a policing problem. So there'd be a multitude of angles to focus on. Plus, I think people really underestimate the extent to which is actually, there are lots of stories about corruption there. The media loves corruption. Look at rape and you'd find lots and lots of different examples to explore, as well as its politics. I think, you know, in terms of a thing like rape culture is a great polemical term. It attracts attention, but it's not a very useful term, I think, in terms of trying to unpack and explore the full dimensions of the problem. So I think it's another challenge to the media is, how do we think about rape? How do we analyse it without automatically reverting to the painful stories? But to get people to start thinking beyond, oh, that's so painful, I don't want to hear about it, to let's think about it, what do we do about it?
Well, one thing that's not painful is listening to your incisive analysis all the time, Lisa. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Eusebius.
Well, after the break, we're going to continue looking at these questions and asking how we can do better in the South African newsroom. Please do tweet us your thoughts and remember to use the hashtag #MeetTheMedia or my handle @Eusebius. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for staying with us on today's episode of Meet the Media. And thank you so much for your tweets as well, Diane. We've got you back. Very difficult conversation this about how to get the coverage of rape as best as possible in our newsrooms. And there's an interesting tweet from one of our viewers there. Conversation on consent, says Luke Sipo, need to happen more as far as rape is concerned, Eusebius. Teach people through the media from the same angle. Now, this is interesting because as a news editor, right, you look for a news story. There we have one of your potential readers, maybe I hope he's one of your readers, certainly one of the viewers of the show, saying they also want an educational element. Do you go to work in the morning, Diane, having an educational element of your job foremost in your mind as well? Or is it all just about what is newsworthy?
I think that there probably needs to be more of an educational element, but the conversations that we have in the newsroom that I was telling you about earlier on, in those conversations, that does often come up. What is the purpose of what we are doing? Why should we actually tell this particular story? I'm interested in this point because it is something that came up in a big international case, the Brock Turner case, with the issue of consent and how it was handled by the courts, the commentary, and I followed that quite closely. But again, that was also a big case that gave you an opportunity, or gave the media an opportunity, to examine other issues. And I think that sometimes that is why the media does go after these big cases, because it does give you that opportunity to say, okay, this is the thing that happened, but then you're able to have different conversations about why and how and what we should learn from it going forward in different mediums. And that's what ideally we should. Now,
the other gossip you and I had while makeup was being put to our faces, and I think we'll illuminate the media better, not by having this show, but what happens behind the scenes when we have the real conversation, are the resource constraints that all of us face in the newsrooms, wherever we are, across the media houses, across the world. And so how feasible is it? I don't even know if it's desirable, but how feasible in the first instance is it for you to be able to have a reporter whose exclusive beat it is to cover sexual violence? Do you have one at the Times?
We don't have one. And with the current resource constraints that we have, not only in my newsroom, but in other newsrooms, I don't think it's something that we would have, anytime soon. You have a situation where you have to cover many topics, and sometimes you have 5 reporters, sometimes you have 10 reporters, sometimes you have 3 reporters for various different reasons. And you have to do a balancing act. And ideally, with stories like this, you want people to be able to go and spend time in communities, but you don't always have that luxury.
Leanne, I thought I had Leanne here over my shoulder. We'll see whether we can get her back, but maybe she can hear me. Because what I wanted to ask is, given how much we've just heard from Lisa in terms of the levels of empathy and training that is ideally required in a reporter to deal sensitively and holistically with a subject that they interview, do we even have the requisite training for someone to be able to handle this kind of complexity?
What I find is that, and this is not only relating to empathy, but oftentimes journalism training gives you really the how to put a story together aspect of it, but not always the how to deal with people when putting a story together. And this is something that Leanne and I have probably learned over time. We both studied together, actually, and we've covered I don't know how many court cases. When I worked in Cape Town, I was a High Court reporter, and I had to cover about 6 child murders in a row. And for me, that was emotionally draining, and it's part of the reason why I stopped being a High Court reporter.
Leanne, we finally have you back, Leanne. A short question for you, a biggie in a way. We'll come back to it in future. One of the debates we've had on this program before is the question of whether news production should be value neutral. And this morning I was wondering, when it comes to sexual violence, for example, is it possible, is it even responsible to think about sexual violence or a rape beat in value neutral terms? Or is this one of the instances, Leanne, as an assignments editor, where you have to say to your troops in the newsroom, you know what, we need to be social justice activists, and here is a justified area for social justice journalism. Forget about this idea of value neutrality.
I think there is an argument for that. When I come in the morning, and I have to again touch on what Diane just said about resources. Sometimes you have 3 reporters, sometimes you have 6, sometimes you have 10. And that, with that in mind, it's very important to then pinpoint which story, and especially social justice stories, rape stories, gender-based violence, child murders and child rapes. You cannot give a story like that to anybody, because it's not everybody's cup of tea. Everybody's going to be reporting on it differently. But to answer your question, I think that there's a need for social justice reporting, and not just value reporting. We have an important job, us as journalists. The pen is very mighty. We have the opportunity to shape people's mindsets, to expose certain things that people wouldn't ordinarily have thought of. And with that in mind, I think that social justice reporting is extremely important, and I think we should start steering towards those lines.
Thank you, Leanne. Thanks for illuminating that for us. Diane, thanks so much for coming, and I've enjoyed every second. And I'm afraid that is all we have time for, at least on television. But of course, this show is platform agnostic. I'm going to be running over to Twitter soon to see what other thoughts you are coming up with and engaging you there using the hashtag #MeetTheMedia. But thank you so much for tuning into this week's edition. From me and the rest of my team, have a wonderful week ahead.